So good morning, everybody, and welcome to, as Steve says, to the second of two webinars we've done about the annual report. So on this first slide, you've got the pictures of the merry band that constitutes the panel. We're multi-professional, multidisciplinary, multi-agency in nature. So people like Jenny and I, who come from local authority children's services background, we have colleagues from police, health, education, and the third sector. And that's intentional because it helps us to fulfill our key role, which is to oversee the system that we have in England, a kind of well-developed system now of undertaking local reviews when children have died or been seriously harmed as a consequence of abuse or neglect. So that's our primary role, is to oversee the reviews that are undertaken by local safeguarding partners, and then also to commission thematic analysis and national reviews. So you'll be aware in November we published our most recent national review about child sexual abuse in the family environment. The annual report, this is our fifth one since the panel's inception, about 6-7 years now, and it provides an opportunity really for the panel to use the evidence from reviews and indeed from the national reviews and thematic analysis to do a stock take about safeguarding child protection system. Clearly, obviously, through that prism of serious incident notifications reviews, i.e. when things have gone very wrong for children, and from that evidence to identify patterns in practice and to identify ways in which child safeguarding policy or practice might need to be enhanced. And in this report, there is a kind of reiteration of a number of those, what will I'm sure be very familiar themes for everybody on this call, around how there is still work to be done to collaborate better, to share information in a more timely and effective way, and generally to remove some of those kind of organisational and cultural barriers to helping us to maximise our potential to help and protect children who are at risk of significant harm. And that those themes are not they're not new, they're fairly perennial themes, and in a sense we've been, I suppose, kind of making the argument for 2 or 3 years now for some of the elements of the new child wellbeing legislation that's going through Parliament, and particularly in terms of the establishment of multi-agency child protection teams. During the year of focus for this report, so this is 23 to 24, we commissioned 2 national reviews. So firstly, the one that I just mentioned about child sexual abuse in the family environment, which Jenny and another colleague led on, working with the Centre for Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse, and we published that in November and are waiting now for government's response to the recommendations, the national recommendations we made in that. But there are, of course, lots of local recommendations in that review, which we hope that at a local level people are reflecting on and considering, because we believe that there are many ways in which we must enhance our ability to protect children who are sexually abused in their families. The other national review about a baby M, has not yet been published for reasons which are sort of beyond our control, but we hope that it will be published later this year, probably in the summer. We also, during 23-24, commissioned 2 pieces of thematic analysis. One, which we will be publishing very shortly next month, is about race, racial bias and racism as evidenced in rapid reviews and LCSPRs, and trying to collate and prompt more learning really around how we can better protect Black, Asian and mixed heritage children. The other thematic analysis was that we commissioned is about neglect, because you'll see this year, as in previous years, neglect remains one of those very it's almost like a kind of wallpaper, to coin a term from somebody who's written quite a lot about neglect. It's one of those aspects of children's lives that is often there, and sometimes, does precipitate a serious incident. But what we see in many of the serious incidents is that neglect has been a feature in a child's life during a considerable period of time. We also finally published a briefing last April about elective home education, and hopefully many of you have kind of read that and used that, because we see, and you'll see again, it's a feature in the analysis this year of the data in serious incidents and rapid reviews. There's a considerable number. It's usually around 10% of children who are subject to serious incident notifications have been electively home educated. And we know that for the vast majority of electively home educated children, they do really well, they thrive, and they're very safe. But there is a small group of children who, being electively home educated, adds to and compounds the vulnerabilities that are already existing in their lives, because those children are no longer in the kind of sight and the ears and eyes of education and other school providers. What we've also done in this report, it's chapter 3, we did it last year, is that we provide a bit of an overview from a panel perspective about the context and conditions that affect child safeguarding, because of course our focus is on what's happened to individual children, but we know that if you think about the conditions for practice, things like the quality of leadership, the quality of supervision, workforce churn, particularly in professional groups like health visiting and social work, you know, the use of agency staff means that there isn't such
the kind of with everything.
So there's quite a bit of kind of reflection on those conditions, and some areas where there's been improvements, but in some areas where there continue to be major challenges, for example, in terms of the ability to access high quality placements for children with complex needs. But we also look at the context, and of course this is quite interesting, and it's quite a sort of ever-changing context, because during the last 18 months we've obviously had a change of government. There is a sort of real kind of emphasis on the reform agenda through new legislation, the establishment of the pathfinders, and now the rolling out of a kind of family first model in local authorities, where the ability to work together with other agencies is going to be absolutely critical. And that's where obviously the work on establishing multi-agency child protection teams will take place. So if we go on to the next slide, so these two slides really just give you a few of the sort of high-level stats. So what the first thing to say is that there was in this year about an 18% decrease from previous years, and we don't have any absolute factual kind of evidence to say why that is the case, but raising questions about, and it may be a mixture of all of these factors, is it because some incidents are not being notified, or perhaps they should be, maybe thresholds for notification in some areas at some times around particular kinds of abuses, perhaps not what it needs to be? Is it because actually there's been a strengthening in some aspects of child protection, and therefore there are fewer serious incidents happening to children? So working with the DFE and the team in the department who work on this, the panel is looking to try and understand and make sense of that a bit more. Of those 330 serious incidents, about half and half for about deaths of children versus instances of serious harm. And remembering, serious harm is very different from significant harm. It is that higher threshold, which in our guidance, we have endeavoured to try and give guidance to safeguarding partners about what constitutes serious harm. And in the panel guidance, which we will be issuing later this year, an updated version of that, we've done a bit more work on trying to clarify that. Then it's perhaps important to kind of note the sort of age vulnerability. So children under 1, babies, are very vulnerable, and for all the reasons that we know and understand, and that's a fairly constant figure of around 36% of children of these incidents are about children under 1. But at the other end of the scale, something like I can't remember the exact figure, but something like 22% of children are 16 or 17. So that's the second most vulnerable age group. And of course, for those children, it is primarily the risk of harm outside their family environment. Then there's two other sort of slightly flattening balloons on that graph are about ethnicity. So firstly, and it's some of these stats which are fairly constant in terms of panel and notifications and reviews, an overrepresentation of Black and Black British children compared to the population, and an underrepresentation of Asian and Asian British children. And it's some of those that sort of data and trying to understand what that's about and what we need to be doing together to address that, so that there is kind of equity in terms of the ability of agencies to really protect different groups of children from different ethnicities. And that obviously is a very strong thread in the race report that we're publishing next month. Intrafamilial non-fatal assault is the leading cause of serious harm at around 30%. So that's not probably altogether surprising. And then on the other side, you'll see that suicides make up 16% of deaths. Now, that's not all suicides of children. That's suicides where abuse or neglect has been deemed to be a feature. And of course, that's always slightly hard to kind of fathom and know. And it is very much for the judgment of local authorities in consultation with their safeguarding partners as to whether they notify. Interestingly, girls have slightly higher suicide rates in relation to this particular cohort of children who completed suicide. And then if we go on to the next slide, so that top slide, I think really, and I think Jenny will pick this up in relation to extrafamilial harm. As I've already indicated, about 10% of children reported to be home educated, and the panel recommended, and along with many other organisations, ATCS have been very lively and active in this space. Lots of, I think, people, and I know kind of police and health partners as well, have been arguing for the importance of having a register, because at the moment, actually, if parents, for example, move from one area to another and don't let the new local area know that they're educating their children at home, those children can actually be completely below the radar. So there are provisions in the bill, as you know, around having registers, but also as proposals around children who are on child protection plan or subject to Section 47 inquiries not being able to be home educated unless the local authority gives its consent. So quite a lot of tightening up in that area. You know, at the end of the day, a lot of this is about good practice and people sharing information, but some of those building blocks we think will be very important. But then there's a bigger group, another group of 15% of children who are just not enrolled in school, and 5% who are not receiving any form of education. So that group of children, not just older children, though there's a particular propensity for older children, but even quite young children who are just not in school and therefore not having that protective oversight of schools. And if you sort of pitch in as well all the kind of data that we have about non-school attendance and persistent children who are persistently not attending at school, that I think is a quite significantly sized cohort. And then in terms of when families are or are not known to children's social care, something like 9 out of 10 instances, a family has been known to children's social care, but that could be sometimes, in the last 5 or even 10 years. So it may not be currently known. What we do know is that 41% were or had been children in need. Again, some at the time of the incident and some in the past, and maybe they'd been sort of, to use the phrase, stepped down to early help or indeed no involvement from any specialist service. And then that one on the right, about 27% of children being or have been on a child protection plan. And that is composed of about, I think the figure is 9.7% to be precise, of children who are actually on a child protection plan at the time of an incident. So less than 1 in 10, but a bigger group, just over a quarter, who had been on a child protection plan. Jenny and I were in a a teach-in yesterday with DFE officials about the annual report, and we had a really interesting discussion about this latter figure and whether should we be aiming to have sort of no instance where children have been or were on at the time on a child protection plan. And I think the discussion, it was a really interesting discussion, and it posed some quite interesting questions for us. And you might want to think about this in terms of your own locality, about when you have an incident where a child has been on a child protection plan or is on one at the time, what, with the benefit of hindsight, and I think rapid reviews do this in many instances, or in LCSPRs, what is there to be learned about what could have been done differently, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, but in terms of providing additional protection or additional help to obviate the likelihood of further kind of concerns. But those are very open questions, and there aren't easy, simple, straightforward statistical answers to them. So what we've done this year, and you're going to hear about the third one, we've focused on 3 spotlight themes to really identify patterns in practice and to highlight some reflective questions for safeguarding partners, for practitioners in relation to these 3 areas. So the first one is about safeguarding children with mental health needs, and the next one, which is about safeguarding children where the parents have mental health needs, was the subject of a previous webinar. And so in relation to the children with mental health needs, some really important kind of learning across the reviews. So this is, learning that's come from you collectively, combining, the messages and the recommendations and the findings from rapid reviews and LCSPRs. Firstly, that absolute crucial, it's sort of it's a sort of one of those bleeding obvious things, but harder to do in practice, is making sure that agencies are really working together and planning together, because quite often with this group of children, you can have children mental health services working in one space and children's social care being involved because of maybe child protection concerns in another. And actually too often that planning and understanding about what help is being offered, what the diagnosis is, what the assessments are, just not happening in the high quality way it needs to be. But also that point about early intervention, and recognising some children have mental health needs as a consequence of trauma. And so what can be done in terms of early intervention to address those mental health, emotional needs as they emerge to prevent the likelihood of them escalating. And then finally, that point about children's voice, keeping that absolutely central in care planning, particularly with kind of teenagers. Too often you have a sense that families, the adults are all rushing around and working together, but the child is kind of lost and not at the heart of the decision making. And then the second one, which was about mental health, the biggest issue here, I think, is, 2 things. Firstly, that adult professionals, so professionals working with adult services and children's professionals working in children's services need to understand really the impact of parental mental health and understanding the history of that. And it may be that people are quite well now, but if, for example, they cease taking their medication, that can, and we saw this in a number of instances, lead to a rapid spiral in their health and their capacity to look after their children. So really having that very timely understanding of the impact is important. But the other big thing, I think, is around too often we have adult services and mental health services working in their separate domains, and actually when there are children, it's really crucial that adult professionals understand the impact of mental health on children and vice versa, and keeping that important communication going. But you can read more about those themes by going back to the report, and we will in fact also be publishing a report about the webinar which focused on those 2 themes. But today we're focusing on the third theme, which is about extra-familial harm. I'm going to hand over now. No, we're going to pause, I think, and then Jenny is going to pick up.
Thank you, Annie. I know you had a lot to cover in that. There are one or two questions I think we can answer a lot of these offline as well, because they are progressive questions about what next with the national panel reviews coming up and so on. But just a couple to pick up on. Question 4 is about the ICBs. Great to see so many colleagues from health joining us today. How do you view the role of ICBs in supporting this work and the victim-centric commissioning? What's their role for health?
So shall I kick off, give you a bit of a break,
Jenny.
Annie? And so obviously ICBs coordinate safeguarding within their area, but also providers do as well. And in terms of, I'm not quite sure what you mean by victim-centric, but I'm presuming that's around commissioning, which one recognises children, which sometimes in block contracts can be difficult, but a real focus on children, and also on within that on vulnerability as well. And we called in our national report on children with disabilities and complex needs, I know, which was about the high-end children around residential care, but a very clear national and local recommendations around joint commissioning. And I know that when budgets are challenged, that also comes under challenge. But really, what we talk about is from evidence from reviews, and the importance of joint commissioning for children, not only sharing those budgets, but sharing those priorities are really, really important. And where that happens well, it has, as you all know, a really, really good impact. And with safeguarding, partnerships can influence commissioning in the area from the work they do. And ICBs are a third responsible partner that's set out in legislation and national guidance. So really important that all partners are aware of their commissioning responsibilities. Annie, I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jenny. So a couple of other questions which the author has kindly said, for the end of the session, but maybe one of the panel members can pick it up. So the first one about when might the panel's thematic review focus on child neglect be coming? That's question 2. I think we can answer that. And a comment about Sarah Sharif as well, and the potential, I know there'll be an LSCPR on that by Surrey, and the National Crime Agency are also involved, but I don't know whether the panel know of any time frame when you might expect that review. Obviously hugely important, so perhaps answer that as well. There is another question about health, since we're on the topic. Did the review findings demonstrate any good practice in terms of agencies responding to sexual exploitation and specialised support for this? NHS England in 2028, possibly not, 2018, I imagine, stated the victims of sexual abuse would receive lifelong counselling, mental health support, but it's difficult to see the impact of this. So that would be, 2018.
So just quickly to so neglect, I can't give you a date, sorry. It's partly the nature of these things, but we will kind of make sure that when it is available, it becomes available. I don't think it would be appropriate for us to talk about a review about individual children, but I know that there was the point that was raised about the judiciary, and what I would say on that is that in relation to the national review on sexual abuse in the family, people may have noted we invited the president of the family division to look at that report, particularly in terms of the findings about family court proceedings, to review that, to take stock of that in terms of court practice, and we're confident that will very much happen, and will be led by appropriate people within the family court system. And then the point about victims and counselling, I think it is a really important one, and we again do talk about that in terms of sexual abuse in the family, and of course it is an issue that's been highlighted by the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and government is going to be responding to the recommendations from that inquiry sometime during the spring. So we may see something a bit more on that.
Oh, thank you very much. So the other questions are being answered as well by panel members in the background. Thank you very much for that. So a couple on the stats and so on, but just want to pick up on 6 briefly, which is what was there evidence of gender bias? For example, girls not seen as at risk of criminal exploitations and boys not seen as victims of sexual exploitation. Did that come out at all in the review?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up that. I was going to pick it up in my presentation bit.
I thought you might, yes.
What comes out generally, as well as the sample that were picked up for this focus in the annual review, is that what LSCPRs are picking up that young, and I say young people involved in criminal exploitation and indeed serious youth violence are not being seen, or one of the things they picked up was they weren't being seen as children, and the focus was on their behaviour in terms of particularly if they were involved in the criminal justice system, rather than understanding children's trauma, and that actually they needed to be safeguarded. And I think that's where this so I make that as a comment, that a finding that's come out for both girls and boys out of rapid reviews and LSCPRs, and the word adultification is used and often wasn't seen to be explored as much as it should have been. And alongside that, and I'll mention about the importance of children having a history of trauma, and if that would have early intervention early on when children seem to be showing evidence of issues that might be happening at home or outside of the home, those early intervention opportunities either were missed or the support wasn't put in for a long enough period of time. But I'll pick up more on that Steve in the next part of the presentation.
Excellent. Also, I think you're also going to be picking up on the 2 or 3 questions about ongoing mental health. So they're number 11, 13 and 14 on the list. So ongoing serious mental health issues considered serious harm, perhaps where children have experienced DVDA and engagement with education is impacted. Intersectional negative experiences early create very vulnerable young people later. And the discussion goes on, number 13, in relation to parents, including parents with mental health needs, we need to consider the weight of influence, as if perpetrators hold more influence due to grooming and coercion, then this will significantly impact on the parents' ability to safeguard their children. So I know you're going to pick up on that as a theme in the next section. And 14, so encouraged to hear emphasis of whole family mental health and the understanding about supporting parents' mental health for themselves and the mental health of their babies. And a comment about training professionals, number 18, to inform robust decision making, but who is training the judiciary? I think that's probably a response to the Sarah Sharif issues that will no doubt come out in the reviews. There is an opportunity for anybody to raise hand in MS Teams and come off mute and ask a question. You can do that, and we're going to have another Q&A session once Jenny's delivered on interfamilial harm. Just a quick pause, see if anybody has any burning issue or question. And anyway, please capture it in the forum so we can respond to it following the webinar and publish that report back to you. Okay, no hands up. Great. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Jenny, and you're going to talk about interfamilial harm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So if I can move on to the next slide. Yes, so just to set the scene a bit for this, some key stats and figures. Apologies for my dog here. First of all, 78 incidents were reported, with 56% of these involving youth or gang-related violence. So, it's still a significant part. This is, this year is building on previous years where we've seen the number of incidents certainly maintain that number and slightly grow. 55% of these involve child criminal exploitation and 40% involving child sexual abuse or exploitation. So still a significant part of the serious incidents and the review process. 97% of children experienced extrafamilial harm were aged 11 to 17 years old, and so they make up a considerable part, as Annie was saying, in terms of the two largest areas, children under 3 and 11 to 17 years old. And again, and it won't come as a surprise, Black children were clearly overrepresented again in the last year, making up 24% of the extrafamilial harm cases, which is significantly different to their percentage in the population. And then 26% of children experience extrafamilial harm were not enrolled in a school or receiving an education, and 59% had poor school attendance. And I'm going to pick up on that in one of the following slides. But first of all, just to give a case study here, and this is we particularly picked this out because of the role of the GP in terms of supporting this young boy. So 15-year-old boy who'd been involved in gang activities and also had faced disruptions to his education over quite a period of time due to his so he was neurodiverse, which again we're seeing more and more young people who have neurodiversity issues or education, health and care plans, and a lack of mental health support. So despite his suspensions and exclusions, his current school were providing strong support with a tailored programme. And indeed, this local authority, from their data, studying their data, had seen that many children who weren't in education and also that their attendance was slipping, was becoming a real issue for the area. So they created a new attendance support team to address persistent absences. And really, absence from school, we do a lot of focus when children are out of school or in alternative provision, but persistent absence or increasing absence can really be seen as an indication of whether or not a child might be facing challenges, outside of the home, which were making them vulnerable, but also can be a measure of the quality of care and support they're getting within their home. So, key aspects of this case, it emphasises the importance of tailored support and consistent commitment from schools in maintaining education and being in an education setting right through from nursery to 16 plus, as we all know, is a really important protective factor for children and improves their outcomes, peer support, and accessing services that schools can provide. So really important, and very clear from the reviews that commitment to education and maintaining their education for children experience extrafamilial harm is really, really important. This school that this child went to had significant knowledge, as many schools do, of their local community and peer relationships, both within school and out of school, and that really helped in understanding and addressing his needs. And the local authority education service with the specialist attendance team to track and reduce absences was also beginning to make a real difference. So what this really shows is that the case study underscores the importance of a supportive and flexible education environment in helping children experiencing extrafamilial harm, but also it coalesces other agencies, and I particularly talked about health input here, in order to stay in education. So that leads very nicely onto cross-cutting findings of extrafamilial harm, which again, I'm sure will be familiar to you, but were very clear in terms of rapid reviews and local safeguarding practice reviews conclusions. First of all, multi-agency working, and there was a question around what good practice have you seen, and what is clear in the terms of sometimes over the process of doing the review, local areas are creating multi-agency teams, particularly to look at extrafamilial harm, and bringing agencies together in sometimes co-located but also having virtual support. So police and social care and health might be being co-located, but then wrapping round that clear links into mental health services and housing services. So really important. And that crossover, it says crossover here between harm and crossover to between harm in the family, child sexual abuse in the family, and then the vulnerability that that can make for children out in the community, and therefore being vulnerable to exploitation. It says here clear roles and responsibilities, but what that really does mean is an understanding of people's roles and responsibilities and the work they do. And that particularly came out in terms of understanding mental health assessments, and what work is being done so that can be supported. So real focus on multi-agency working. Education's role, I've said, really pivotal, and also in supporting education colleagues in terms of training, accessibility to information because of their role in improving outcomes, but also that safeguarding environment for vulnerable children. And in addition, online activity and the role that schools can play, not only in terms of education, but also monitoring online activity when children, as part of the school day. And then I won't say finally, because most important, clearly the voice of the child is always important to us, but that being at the heart of assessments and plans. And what reviews, when children were involved in those reviews, very clearly saying, I would have wanted to have been asked, I'd wanted those opportunities to talk about what I was experiencing, and then that informing assessments and plans, and also review in terms of children's experiences. That also helping in terms of parents and carers understanding what was being put into place, but also having an input about what they needed in terms of keeping their children safe. Very regular communication, and that trusted person, continual, the continuity of support that's being provided, and the individuals that are involved, so people can feel listened to, but also have an increased understanding of what's happening to the children, and the support that can hopefully work and create a safer environment. So I think now we're on to questions again. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Jenny. And please, if you want to ask a question in the old-fashioned style, just click the raise hand signal in Teams, and we'll bring you off mute and you can ask your questions. So whilst you're thinking about that, there's a couple of thank you for the contributions again. If we look at 21, this is about educational psychologists. Did the review consider any possible role for educational psychologists in supporting those families where school attendance is an issue? As an EP, this is something that comes up frequently in my work in combination with unidentified or unmet SEND needs. And kind of continuing in that phase around early intervention, number 25. This is an excellent part. Early intervention can change so many things for children and families. It can mean the difference between a parent being able to continue working and support their child, which may then impact home income and bring additional layers of trauma and isolation, which this type of trauma brings. Pathway to support are generally not clear. Mental health support teams would be a great offer in schools. Diagnostic support would be great to have on site. And somebody else completely agreeing that the school should be a protective factor, but schools are really struggling to include children as they have not got the resource. How do you see schools managing this? Also, with regard to children accessing the curriculum who are neurodivergent and who find school differently. So you mentioned a lot of those things. What's the best outcome, do you think, for that early intervention, Jenny?
So what reviews and the evidence showed that there were, for all the cases that came through, opportunities early on, and I say in school life, but I'm just, in terms of age, where not just children but families could have been supported, and really looking at the underlying causes for behaviour. So, children hadn't been suffering extra-familial harm all their childhood. There was early identification of vulnerabilities, often from schools, and even though support was put in, it was often episodic. So it was in for a period of time, a few months, and then it was withdrawn. And it just underlines the need that some children and families need a little bit of help all the time, as opposed to a lot of specialist help. So that preventative help, and really important of that learning, is, I think, should be picked up in terms of family hubs. And every local area has got now funding in terms of family help reforms. Absolutely, that support around schools is really, really important, not only in terms of training staff, but the other bit was around responding to when schools saw concerns early on, and schools feeling that their early on concerns weren't picked up. And if support is put in early, then that can really improve outcomes, but also save the amount of support that had to be put in at a later date. But I very much pick up in terms of schools and the pressures they're under. Now, there are mental health teams in some schools in some parts of the country, and which are working well, but not every area has got that. I know. Annie, I don't know whether you want to pick up a bit more on that.
No, I mean, the thing about schools and safeguarding it, I mean, I suppose this is a sort of connected point, is that there has been obviously a lot of panels sort of push for this as well, about schools and other education providers being, and also early years providers being, much more part of the safeguarding partnership fabric at a local level. And, it is quite complicated because there's no one single organisation in the way that there is with the local authority, health, or the police. But, the most recent working together, and I think, the bill that's going through Parliament will, I think, put much more emphasis on the need to really involve schools at a kind of operational, but also at a strategic level, because I think schools still feel sometimes their voice is not at the table when it needs to be. So it's a kind of related point, but one that actually can help and get that better system perspective on the important and involvement around the importance of school.
Yeah, just picking up on educational psychologists and that.
Yes.
Well, it was also a comment and a question. Absolutely agree. Educational psychologists are key, and they're key in early intervention and supporting children with early identification of specialist needs. What we're also aware of is that in some parts of the country, they're really stretched as well, and that the training program for bringing on more educational psychologists is also a limiting factor, but want to acknowledge their importance, as was said in the chat.
Yeah, excellent. And another couple of points on the education theme. Picking up on that early intervention, and Annie, you mentioned early years, but there's a question about alternative provision as well. So 27, many of the children, as described in the case study, will end up attending alternative provision. My worry is that this is unregulated, and having worked on a local assurance process, many providers of AP do not have rigorous safeguarding training, process, policy and practice in place. I find this concerning given the increased vulnerability of the children attending. Is the remove to provide better regulation of this sector? In a similar way to the EHE provision, there's more to be done. So comment please on alternative provision. Annie?
Well, yes, I mean, I think the concerns of colleague there, I think we would all share. And of course, there are some really excellent alternative education providers who take safeguarding very seriously. I mean, because they have to, partly because of the nature of the cohort they're working with. But there are some that are a bit more can be a bit more fast and loose, and not so strong on the kind of safeguarding. And I there is an argument about greater regulation, etc., and it's their relationship with individual schools is often quite complicated. I think it's something that at a local level, safeguarding partners need to understand in terms of their safeguarding responsibilities and in terms of what support or challenge local education alternative providers may need. Jenny, you might have something to add.
Well, no, I was just going to bring up the regulation and the opportunity for safeguarding partners to understand what providers are in their local area, because there may well be some misconceptions about who's operating, but the importance of alternative provision and understanding particularly vulnerability outside of the family, is a point well made.
Yeah. Good. So lots of agreement in the forum here, and number 33 said, agreed. In some cases, it feels like this is a license to print money, which leads to underfunding in other areas. That's a comment back to the alternative provision providers. Perhaps an aspect of early intervention needs to start with those who are exploiting. It is quite often the case that those perpetrators of exploitation are or have been known to services, so they have been through the similar paths. We are a SEN provision for early years. We see how important it is for our children to be in education. However, due to the lack of specialist provision in the area, there are many children who are having to be home educated. We have raised the concerns as many of these have previously had involvement.
Steve,
so yes, Annie.
Well, what I just really wanted to pick up would link the comment that you just read out there about perpetrators with a comment earlier on. I think it was about the involvement of working. Are we normalising young people,
by using the word
involvement in gangs?
Yes, number 22 and 23. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, because I think that's a really important and quite a difficult kind of question. And I mean, we know that working in any aspect of child protection is emotionally extremely taxing and demanding, and can be extremely highly stressful and so on. But I think there is something around working with children, because they are children and young people who are involved in gangs. So being criminally exploited, but it may also be about sexual exploitation. Because you have that sense, if you're a practitioner or a manager, you really don't know what's going on, what is actually going on in their lives. So, I mean, you may have that feeling about working with a family, but it's probably a bit easier to have some comprehension. And there is, I mean, certainly when I worked in as a DCS in a London borough that began with L but wasn't Lewisham. It was something we had quite a lot of kind of conversations about, and about how we both recognise that practitioners potentially could be being vicariously traumatized by what was happening and what they were hearing about what was happening to children and young people, but also because one response can be to sort of dampen down and not to normalize, but to sort of, not to see it in the same, for the seriousness as it is. So I think that is a real issue, and I think it's incumbent on leaders and managers to make sure that people have the reflective space to really sort of name and understand how they are responding and reacting, both individually but actually together, because if we start being inured to children being exploited and abused in this way, then we won't be able to help them. So I think it is really important. And the other side of that question about perpetrators may be known, and I mean, that's right. And of course, sometimes we know, and we see this in some of the reviews that the panel sees, that children have been, in a sense, it's a bit of a binary way of seeing children, but sometimes they have been victims, i.e. they have been hurt themselves. And sometimes they are those that they are perpetrating abuse on others. And sometimes the people who are perpetrating are kind of, adult males, adult mainly, but not always men. And I think that, it really emphasises the importance of that join up between, police intelligence, local authority intelligence from schools, and being really kind of open and transparent about that. And, that does involve a degree of trust and respect across professional groups, because that's the only way in which the evidence about perpetrators can be identified and actually used, hopefully, to prosecute them when there is that evidence.
And can I just sort of add there, not necessarily for prosecution, but the importance of general practitioners, GPs, who are often the service that both parents and carers and perpetrators go to, particularly if they're in the same family, but not necessarily, and GPs being able to look for the signs and know that they need to share some information. And there was some comments in the chat around that, Steve, which I think are important.
Yeah, one of which, just leading on from that, is 39. It might be useful to join up better the youth justice, SIN and IMR process with the LCSPR's process to better understand the journey to offending and gang involvement. So thank you for picking up on that, and thank you for that kind of useful debate about the word involved and whether we should also query gangs. Number 40. At one point, does a group of people become a gang? The power of language was so important to recognize that even the word gang comes into many underlying assumptions about the people involved in it. So yeah, that kind of unconscious bias,
really good point,
from practitioners.
Really good point.
So we're sort of coming to the end. I just wondered if Jenny, you wanted to close out and then hand over to Annie for the final thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have. The only other thing I'd say, and it is picked up in the chat when we talked about crossover between harms, quite a lot of evidence within a family, and I'm not making any, in terms of parents and carers protecting their children or supporting their children is very challenging in this area, but there was evidence of some type of domestic abuse and particularly violence within the home, parents with mental health challenges, and leading to that broader neglect, which picks up to an earlier comment which I wanted to pick up on, was around the expectations we put on parents and carers who have their own vulnerabilities or indeed might be subject of particularly coercive control. Picked up that in our child sexual abuse within the family report, but really that awareness and points well made. Thanks, Steve.
Right. Thank you, Jenny. And just be assured that these comments, we will respond to these comments. We will produce that. There is a video of this webinar that will be launched on YouTube as well. So look out for that. And upcoming webinars will be published. And you're going to note from Amina. So thank you both. Annie, do you want to close us out?
Yes, just to say thank you all for some really, insightful and rich kind of questions and comments. I think some of the debate that's been raised about language, really important and, kind of useful checks for us. And some of those other issues that have been raised about education, early intervention, SEN systems and so on. So thank you very much for your contributions, and we hope that it's been useful and that you will encourage your colleagues in your local kind of areas to use the reflective questions in the actual annual report to kind of prompt and provoke the kind of discussion that obviously helps us all to kind of continuously improve and enhance our practice. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Annie. So there is a link to the evaluation survey. Please, we are running a series of this National Review Panel webinars. So any feedback, improvements are most welcome. So please click the link and do the evaluation. And yes, the webinar series will be published. Look out for the previous webinars that you haven't seen on YouTube. And the communication with the panel is shown on the slide at the moment. So please pick up that. Get yourself on the newsletter, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Bye for now.